Good evening, and welcome to the Yves Mény Annual Lecture at the Robert Schuman Center. My name is Eric Jones, and I'm director of the Robert Schuman Center, which makes it very, very pleasant to be here to talk a little bit about the guy who founded this place in the first place. So we have this lecture and have had this lecture every year since 2014 to honor Yves Mény when he started the place back in 1993. And over the 30-odd years that the Robert Schuman Center has existed, first under Yves Mény's directorship and then under his presidency of the EUI, and the many and excellent directorships that followed, the Robert Schuman Center has grown from about 4 people to about 400 people. And in doing so, it has begun to reach its interests into all corners of the social sciences as they affect contemporary European life. In that tradition, what we do with the Yves Mény Annual Lecture is invite someone from within the European University Institute's academic community to present some aspect of their ongoing research. Now, what we're going to hear today is research that's being done by Bernard Hoekman in the context of his ERC Advanced Grant Fellowship, which is a project that has a very difficult name to remember if you look at it as a name, but a great acronym, PIANO. And the PIANO project that Bernard Hoekman and his team are doing is the background for this conversation that we'll have on global trade in transition. Now, Bernard is ideally suited to do this, and in order to prepare for this introduction, I went back and read through his CV. I went through the usual stuff to watch his career develop at the World Bank after he had done his undergraduate degree at the University of Rotterdam and his graduate work at the University of Michigan. And as I looked through the 27 pages of publications to try to find something interesting that I could tell you about, I discovered the most shocking fact, which is that he won twice the American Express Essay Prize in the early 1990s, in 1991 and 1993. And I think the 1993 competition was the one where Adam Posen also got a prize for his work on central bank independence. And I went to my shelf and realized that I'd accidentally thrown away the collection of the 1993 essays. I have the 1994 essays. I'll never throw a book away again. Having said that, Bernard has been running the Global Economy program here at the Robert Schuman Center for more than a decade and tried to move into retirement when the ERC called him back and forced him to undertake this research project. So we're going to be very excited to hear what he has to say. When Bernard is finished talking, I'll invite him and our colleague Stephanie Hoffman up to the podium, or actually up to the table, so that Stephanie can moderate the discussion. Now, Stephanie is perfectly equipped to moderate this discussion because she was trained not just in the international relations field specifically, but also through one of the very first transnational master's programs ever created, the transnational transatlantic masters, the TAM, that was run out of the University of North Carolina and other institutions in Europe, which is interesting because when she started that program, I'm sure I lectured to that cohort. And so I'm wondering why she doesn't remember me since I leave such a strong first impression. Stephanie has written prize-winning work on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. She's moved on to study international regime complexes to help us better understand the structure of our world. And in moderating the discussion, I hope you'll challenge her as well as Bernard to explain to us what exactly is happening today, because the way trade and international organization is evolving is too complicated for mere mortal minds to comprehend. We need their expertise to help us to navigate this situation. And the only way that we can start is with a warm round of applause for Bernard Hoekman.
Thank you. I was very impressed with the pronunciation of my name. You've been practicing, right? So I'm Dutch, I have a Dutch name, and I anglicize my name almost automatically. So I almost never call myself Hoekman, but now I can start calling myself Hoekman again. Okay, so I'm going to talk about global trade in transition. So I need to click. And what I'm going to talk about, as Eric mentioned, is essentially ongoing work in this ERC project, but it's bits and pieces of lots of things that we've been doing for quite a while here at the Schuman Center, which revolve around the multilateral trading system, revolve around the WTO. How does the WTO work? You know, we've had people coming here in terms of executive training when we still did executive training, you know, get delegates from the WTO here. So it's something that is not just part of this project, but it's something we've been kind of focused on for quite a while. So you all know where we are. Those of you who read newspapers, which I assume is going to be most of you. So every day for a while when you opened a newspaper or read anything or listened to the news on TV, it was just one disaster after another in terms of body blows to the multilateral trading system. And of course, that was all due to the Trump administration, right? So this started off under Trump 1.0, where Trump kind of initiated a trade war against China, but more generally, pretty much everyone, including the European Union, on steel, aluminum. Then that was followed by the Biden administration, and of course, Biden was completely kind of orthogonal to Trump in many, many ways, except when it came to trade. Right, so Biden was a multilateralist. You know, he signed the Paris Agreement. He spent a lot of time and effort in trying to cooperate with other countries. But the Biden administration, of course, reflected the Democratic Party's kind of opposition to trade, and essentially they decided that we're no longer in the business of negotiating new trade agreements, and we're also not in the business of supporting the multilateral trade order. Right, so the Biden administration was the one that consistently killed off the appellate body in the WTO, and essentially just let the WTO flounder. So there's a little bit of a continuity between Trump and Biden, and I think this reflects kind of a common view among Republicans and Democrats that trade is not particularly good for them, but that actually being subject to rules which are enforceable is even worse, right? So that's kind of, everybody knows this, it's all in our heads, but what I want to also emphasize here is that it's not just the US, right? So what we're seeing over the last 5-10 years or so is really a reversal towards unilateral action, right? A shift away from multilateral cooperation. And that shift is also something that is happening here in the European Union, right? So the European Union has been quite aggressive, I would argue, in using trade to achieve all kinds of non-trade objectives, right? And we see that reflected in things like the EU deforestation regulation. We see that reflected in the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We see it in terms of legislation on corporate sustainability due diligence. So there's a lot of these things where essentially trade is being used as a stick. You could also say potentially a carrot. But again, this is all unilateral. This is developed in Brussels. There's no cooperation. There's no real discussion with other countries. It's just, it's our way is the way you have to go. So I think that's something to bear in mind as I go along, because in a sense, the European Union is now confronting the results of this unilateral tack that it's taken, right? So we're in a world where Trump and the US administration is essentially destroying the world trade order. The European Union, of course, is very dependent and is very committed to a rules-based trading system, but is also finding itself kind of confronting a lot of countries that say, you know, you guys have also been sticking knives in our backs, right? So you're not necessarily as holy as you think you are. So that creates a bit of tension, and that's kind of something we can come back to in the course of this lecture. So, and of course, in the background to all of this is we have both the US saying, we don't like the trading system anymore. We have the EU saying, we're going to use trade as an instrument to achieve non-trade objectives. And all of that kind of translates into restrictions on trade, right? So the trading regime in the world becomes less open. And that, of course, is something that many people are not necessarily uncomfortable with, right? Because there has been a backlash against globalization. There's a lot of people who argue globalization went too far. It's had adverse social and distributional consequences. So in a sense, what we're seeing is not something that many people would necessarily disagree with in terms of the direction of travel. Now, the way it's being done, I think many people who question the value of trade would say, well, this is not exactly the way we should be doing things, but the ultimate result is something that I think there's a lot of support for. So again, so this is the background, and the basic questions I'm going to ask in the course of this lecture is there scope for revitalizing not the multilateral rules-based order, particularly in the area of trade, but in a way of sustaining what has been built up over time, maintaining that, and prevent the unravelling that we're seeing happening today. And in particular, what's the role of the EU in that process? So let me start with a bit of data in terms of what's been happening in the last 10 years or so. So these are figures that draw on the Global Trade Alert. The Global Trade Alert is an initiative that is run by Simon Evenet, who is now at IMD, which he started in 2009 when the G20 came out after the global financial crisis and said, we promise not to engage in protectionism, right? So yes, we're in a crisis. We're going to do a lot on the fiscal side, the financial side, but we're not going to do what happened in the 1930s and revert back to trying to shelter our domestic markets. So Simon said, okay, I'm going to see whether you guys actually live up to your promises, right? And that's the genesis of the Global Trade Alert. Now, of course, that's a long time ago. That's 2009. But in the process, because he's kept this going, it's a really valuable source of information on what governments are doing that affects trade, right? So this is not necessarily just tariffs and trade policy. This is also industrial policy. These are things like procurement, regulation. So essentially what they do through web scraping and seeing what is posted on the internet by the major countries of the world economy is to say, okay, what are they actually doing? So one of the things that has been ongoing in the Global Trade Alert for the last few years is to say, okay, let's try and also get more of a sense of why governments are doing what they're doing, right? So what are the underlying objectives? And in particular, that exercise started during the Biden administration when the US returned to very active industrial policy. So one of the questions that was asked by the Global Trade Alert is, okay, so are countries doing this more generally? What is being done? So what we are plotting here, and this comes out of a paper that I co-authored with Rohit Tikku, who is sitting there, and Bedri Tas, who is a former Jean Monnet fellow. So actually, a lot of the work we're doing is done by groups of people who used to be here and have left, right? So one of the nice things about Schuman is this is a very networked place. So many of you who are fellows, are likely to be working on projects 10, 20 years from now with people that you met here, and that will continue going. So that's really one of the things I really appreciate about the Schuman Center and this model of fellowships. That's an aside. So what you see in the data here, this is the number of measures taken between 2009 and 2024, classified by objective. So the small bar here on the left is national security. So these are measures taken in the name of and in the pursuit of national security. The second bar is economic resilience, which is essentially supply chain type related interventions. A lot of that dates back to COVID, where suddenly governments became aware that supply chains actually mattered. Then we have the third bar here is climate. So measures that are taken to mitigate climate change or to combat climate change. And then the highest number of measures that we see in the data set have to do with competitiveness, right? So essentially trying to improve the competitiveness of particular sectors or firms. If you look at the right-hand graph, that breaks it down over 5-year periods. And what you can see is that there's really been a shift in the last 5 years or so away from climate as a motivation for these types of industrial policy, trade-related measures, towards national security, right? So national security is the second row. On top here, we have climate. So it used to be a very large share of everything that was being done was actually trying to deal with climate change, using trade as an instrument to mitigate climate change. And at the bottom bar, you have competitiveness, which is relatively constant. So we're seeing a number of objectives being pursued by governments which are not necessarily economic, right? So the national security dimension is relatively new in terms of the number of measures that are being pursued, but also when it comes to things like climate change. So who are the players here? So who are the big actors in terms of using these types of policy interventions for these types of objectives? Not surprisingly, the US and the EU are the main players, right? So they do the most in terms of putting in place new measures. And you can also see that in some dimensions, the EU is really up there, right? So on strategic competitiveness, you know, the EU with almost 1,900 measures over the period really is quite large, but climate change is even larger, right? So the EU is a big player on this field. And again, going back to my initial graph where you say, okay, this is really the US, Trump is kicking down the trading system. We also see the EU pursuing a huge number of what are essentially unilateral. This is all unilateralism at work in terms of doing things to trade or with trade to achieve often non-trade objectives, right? So I'm not questioning the normative dimension of that. This is just, you know, facts. So this is really what we see in the data. What you also find is you find some countries like Brazil that come up here quite frequently. Not surprisingly, on national security, you see Russia, but it's a relatively small number of countries, right? So you could say this maps pretty well onto the G20, or at least the large countries in the G20. Now, Chinese data is probably not as good. So even though Simon kind of scrapes all the Chinese websites as well, and the Chinese actually do publish more data than you might think, they're likely to be underrepresented because they're not necessarily as clear as to what the objective is of a particular policy instrument. Now, if you look at then what is being done, what are the instruments that are being used to pursue these types of industrial policy objectives, you also find quite a bit of heterogeneity, which is kind of interesting in terms of the revealed preference, or I guess perceptions of the revealed utility of using particular instruments to pursue a given goal, right? So what we've done here on the left-hand side is to break down the share of all instruments that are used for particular objectives, distinguishing between industrial policy, which is the 4 categories I mentioned earlier, and other types of objectives that motivate interventions. And what you can see is that for the industrial policy set, import restrictions play a relatively big role, right? So that's the yellowish bar on the left. Subsidies are big, but much less big than they are for other instruments. And what you also see is that export support, export subsidies, is also a big feature of the industrial policy landscape. And what that points to is the use of these instruments is not just to restrict trade. Quite frequently, what these instruments are doing is they're actually promoting trade. They're trying to help firms from a particular country compete in third markets, and that's done through a variety of subsidies quite frequently, and often export subsidies are playing a big role there. The right-hand block breaks down the use of instruments across industrial policy objectives, and not surprisingly, you find that for climate change-related interventions, it's mostly subsidies, right? So that is by far the preferred instrument. And of course, this aggregates across all countries. This is not just an EU or a US story, this is just what we see in the data. At the bottom, where you look at instruments that are being used to pursue national security objectives, you find, not surprisingly, a lot of use of export restrictions, but also a large category of other stuff, other types of instruments, which are not traditional trade policy instruments. So that category includes what is something called controls on commercial transactions and investment, right? So we have foreign direct investment policies in there already, so investment screening is already captured. So this is other stuff. So this is governments being creative, and if you start thinking about what that actually is, and you talk to some of the bureaucrats who are doing this, they'll tell you, well, this is things like we keep track of when our firms go to China, and we want to know what they're doing in China, right? Now, quite frequently, that is not reported, so it doesn't get picked up in the Global Trade Alert, which is only about public publicly available information, but that's the kind of thing that is ongoing there. So basically, if you step back, you say many countries are pursuing a whole range of different types of objectives using trade-related instruments, which create negative spillovers on other countries, right? And the question that it kind of informs the project is to say, okay, can we map the objectives that countries are pursuing against instruments and try and identify where there are potential clubs of countries that have the same objective, that are using particular instruments which are creating negative effects on each other, so there might be more scope for cooperation in that kind of context, as opposed to one where I say, I have an enemy, I'm really seriously worried about what country X is doing, and therefore I use these instruments, but there's not going to be much scope for cooperation there in terms of dealing with the problem. Although I'll come back to that, there might actually be more than we think. Okay, what you can also do if you look at this data is to kind of look at who are the big players in this industrial policy, trade policy landscape, right? And again, this is all unilateral, right? There's a whole different world out there of trade agreements, et cetera, which we can come back to. But this is what countries are doing by themselves, for themselves. And if you just run network type analysis on this data and you look at what's the relationship between a country taking an action for whatever motivation, how long does it take for other countries to start doing the same thing? Right, and again, there's no presumption here of causality, that one is causing the other. This is really just, again, looking at the data to see, is there some kind of dynamic going on where countries start doing something and lots of other countries also start doing something very similar. And what you see, if you just look at the average, the network centrality measures, you find, again, not surprisingly, that the US and the EU are kind of up there in terms of the number of instances in which they do something and that gets then also done, that is emulated. Maybe emulated is the wrong word, but then you see the same kind of policies being implemented by other countries. So what the takeaway from this, and again, this is very much ongoing research, so I'm not going to, there's no claim that we actually kind of have a good sense of whether there is a relationship between doing something and a country following. In some instances, it's very clear that there is this kind of leader-follower relationship. In others, it's much more likely to be a process of learning, right? So one of the things that is of interest and that we're trying to disentangle is what are these kind of dynamics, what explains the dynamics that we see in this pattern of adoption of policies. But again, what comes out is that the set of countries that are prominent in this global industrial policy network are actually quite small. Right, so again, what that suggests is that if we think about the potential for deals and agreements between those countries, we're not talking about 166 WTO members. We're talking about a relatively small number of large countries. Okay, so then what does that imply? And this is the kind of one of the research questions in the whole exercise is, if you go back to the first slide, so we see global trade, kind of the global trading order essentially being really contested and in serious trouble. So if we think about what could we do to kind of keep things as close as we could to where we were, in the sense of creating an environment for firms where there's certainty with respect to what the rules are in markets and that there are credible rules in place to actually guide those economic relationships, right? And this is, of course, stuff that is being discussed in Brussels, in most capitals. Certainly, it's something that is of really strong interest of all the developing countries who have been hit by the Trump administration, who are all scratching their heads and saying, oh my God, what can we do, right? So how can we reduce the tariffs that we're being threatened with? What can we offer the United States? How do we respond to this? Right, so again, even though most of the focus here is going to be on what the EU could do, this is something that applies equally to pretty much every country in the world, except, of course, the United States, who is on their own track. So there's three options. One is to say, okay, we have the WTO, let's strengthen the WTO. So can we put in place a process through which we actually deal with the specific issues that have led to the problems the WTO is confronting. Not just Trump again, but also in the Biden administration. There's a number of countries that are not that happy about elements of the WTO. So revisit the multilateral trade order, launch a new negotiation, launch a negotiating round to say, okay, let's just sit around the table and let's think about what rules need to change. Why couldn't the WTO rules as they are today be an instrument to deal with competition from China and so forth, right? So that's the first option. And essentially what that means is using Geneva as a platform to talk to each other, right? Because, I mean, first you need to kind of develop what the scope is for an agenda before you can start negotiating. So that really is then the first element, saying try and keep the WTO process going, and that requires WTO reform. So for those of you who follow what's been going on in the WTO, there's been an ongoing effort for some time now to try and change the way the WTO works, right? Because one of the reasons the WTO got stuck is because it has a working practice of consensus, right? And consensus is, of course, not particularly conducive to dealing with things rapidly. And so there's been a lot of veto playing for a long time by countries like India. And the death knell has been the US now joining India and saying, we also can be a veto player, and here you go. So anyway, but that's the first kind of strategy, and that's something that's been actively considered in many capitals to say, okay, what can we do to reform the WTO? Can we restart a process that is based in Geneva? The second reaction, and this is one that most countries around the world are pursuing, is to say, okay, let's negotiate trade agreements, both with the bad guy, the Trump administration, right, to try and reduce the threat that we confront with tariffs, and we offer whatever we can to the United States. We package that as a trade agreement, and off we go. That's one dimension of the trade agreement strategy. The other dimension, which is of course more interesting, is there are a lot of countries out there that have negotiated trade agreements. The European Union has dozens of trade agreements with many countries. Many other countries have dozens of trade agreements with each other. All of those countries, in principle, are doing the same thing. A lot of these trade agreements are quite similar to each other. So can we connect the trade agreements to each other, make commitments to each other? So all the members of these agreements would say, well, we are going to stick to a certain approach. Firms will know where they're at when they want to export into our markets, and we will make promises to each other that we're not going to discriminate in favor of the United States, for example, right? So that's one of the big challenges now. So this is something that has been pushed by Cecilia Malmström, who is a former trade commissioner of the European Union. It has been adopted by von der Leyen, who had a speech on this. And essentially the idea is the EU should start by connecting with East Asia and the Pacific, which is the other big trade bloc, where we have a lot of dynamism, we have a lot of countries that depend on trade, and therefore have a self-interest in ensuring that that trade continues to operate on the basis of rules. Right, so EU, CPTPP together is 1/3 of global GDP, 1/3 of global trade. And if you say, okay, if we make that the nascent core of an arrangement of countries that commit to trade on the basis of rules, you can then extend that to all the partner countries they already have. Right, so you could kind of conceptually see pretty easily that you could recreate a rules-based system which includes most countries in the world except for the United States and potentially except for China. Right, and China, of course, the United States is very clear. They don't want to play this game. China may or may not, right? And this is something which remains to be determined. And it's not so much what China would like, but it's also, are we willing to make and engage with China on this? So that's the second track, trade agreements, more trade agreements, connect trade agreements. The third track is plurilateral agreements, right? And plurilateral agreements are essentially mechanisms to cooperate among countries on specific issues. Right, so they differ from trade agreements in that it doesn't cover substantially all trade. Right, it's not about liberalization of market access for pretty much everything that is produced in a set of countries. It's really, we have a particular issue area that we think needs rules. For example, how do we use trade and trade policy to fight climate change? And we're going to focus on that. right? And the flexibility of that approach is, of course, very great. You could do any issue that might bring countries together. So I put a few examples here on the slide: trade and technology, trade and climate. Critical minerals, of course, is one where there's actively discussions ongoing. You could think about negotiating disciplines on subsidies and state-owned enterprises. Now, I am going to go a bit quicker, I think, on this. So just let's briefly think about those three scenarios, right? So the multilateral track, I think, is pretty much doomed to fail, at least in the near term, right? We have the United States, who has said, we don't like the system. We have China, who says, well, we do like the system, or we say we like the system, but all of you guys think we don't really live up to our rules, and there are really fundamental challenges in terms of disciplining what the Chinese government can do in the area of things like subsidies and state-owned enterprises. So I think here the prospects for progress are really quite limited. And I think the most that we could hope for in terms of using the WTO platform is to continue to have discussions among countries on topics that they think are creating negative externalities for each other, right? So I really don't see much in the way of progress being there. So in the trade world, in the nerdy trade world, there are a number of people who have been saying, well, there actually are provisions in the WTO which allow for renegotiations of your tariff commitments. So why can't the United States then engage in a process of renegotiations? And I think the answer to that is the United States doesn't want to. Right, so the United States right now is in a mode where essentially they will dictate what the tariff is going to be, and they will dictate what they want in return. And what they want in return, they're not going to give you compensation, but they're going to say, we want more from you, right? So I'm going to raise the tariffs to 50%, and by the way, you need to give me preferential access to your market, right? So that does not a negotiation make. So I think that's something that is really unlikely to happen, especially at the multilateral level. Connecting the trade agreements seems, on the face of it, much more feasible, right? Because we have a set of countries that are already, we know their type, right? So their type is, we believe in rule-based trade, we believe in open trade, we believe in liberal trade. We've done that already. We signed these trade agreements, tariffs are zero, we trade with each other, we have rules on all kinds of things embedded in those agreements. So connect them. So I think that sounds really straightforward. I think in practice it's going to be extremely difficult, right? So I think doing this is something that is going to be a real challenge. And a necessary condition for moving down that track is a real willingness on the part of the European Union to say, okay, we're going to now accept, we have to be willing to accept that a lot of what goes on in regulatory areas in East Asia and the Pacific is good enough for us. Right, so it implies moving towards a system which is much more based on recognition, on equivalence, and the EU is not particularly good on that type of an approach, right? So the EU is very much about, you need to do things our way. So even though I think there's political interest in this, there's a political willingness, von der Leyen has said this is what we need to do, I think making that an operational reality is going to be very difficult. And if you give it to the trade negotiators to say, okay, we need to connect the CPTPP to the European Union trade agreements, we're going to be sitting here 10 years from now and not a whole lot will have happened. So I'm quite skeptical that that is the way to go. I think it's an important political signaling device, but I don't think it's likely to have much of a bearing. Now, that said, if all those countries continue to abide by their trade agreements, that in itself already gives a lot of certainty to firms, right? Because that is a rules-based type of an approach. But I think going beyond that and connecting them in a meaningful way is going to be quite difficult. So the third option then is this plurilateral cooperation. And essentially here, I think there is potentially more scope to make progress. And the reason for that is we're not dealing with all of trade, we're not dealing with substantially all trade, we're dealing with specific issues where there's a commonality of interest, or where there's a clear case where what I'm doing to you is hurting you enough that you're willing to actually engage in a discussion with me so that we come to some kind of a deal, some kind of an arrangement. right? And again, like I mentioned earlier, that could be lots of different types of issues. But if we think about the core types of policies, going back to the industrial policies that I opened up with, what are the core ones that are really creating both either negative externalities in terms of I'm doing something bad to someone else and that gets them to the table to negotiate with me, or conversely, we have very similar objectives. And in the pursuit of those objectives, unilaterally, and again, all that global trade alert was all unilateralism, maybe we can come up with solutions where it becomes a lot more efficient and effective if we jointly pursue a particular objective using policy instruments that are subject to negotiated rules, which both increase efficiency in terms of reducing spillover effects, but also could increase effectiveness, right? Because if we're really serious about dealing with climate change, doing that just ourselves is not going to really move the needle a whole lot. So that's kind of the theory behind the plurilateral track and approach. And I think there are a lot of benefits that are associated with this in terms of flexibility, in terms of creating platforms that are actually open to very different types of countries that might actually have very different types of objectives if the focus is on a particular policy instrument, or all kinds of different countries that actually have common objectives and where, in principle, it should be easier to come to a deal. Okay, so this is nothing new for the trading system, right? So people think that the multilateral trading system is all about these very large rounds of negotiations where everybody has to agree to everything. That's not really the way the system has worked. So in the past, it was very much a system that was negotiated among smaller groups of countries that essentially had a particular objective that they could deal with amongst themselves, and the benefits were then extended to all the other countries who were not really players in a particular area or not very important. So I don't have time to go through this, but I mean, the main takeaway here is that there's already a huge amount of plurilateral engagement, plurilateral treaties, agreements under the umbrella of the WTO, right? So in that sense, it's nothing new. And since 2015 or so, there actually have been successful efforts at negotiating new plurilateral agreements in the WTO. So although the stylized fact is no big agreements could be negotiated since the creation of the WTO, in practice, a number of agreements have been negotiated that deal with particular issues and which apply to only a subset of the membership. But there's also quite a bit of plurilateral initiative outside the WTO. And here I think it's an interesting dynamic because this is mostly being pursued by countries in East Asia and the Pacific. Right, and what those countries have been doing, but you also see this in Latin America. So we see specific examples of countries saying, we have a bilateral deal, so we recognize each other's trade facilitation mechanisms. Let's make that into a club, right? So we have clubs on what are called authorized economic operators in the customs arena in Latin America. We have that in the ASEAN context. We're seeing a lot of that happening today as well in the digital arena with digital economic partnership agreements. We also are seeing that happening in critical minerals. In 2024, there was a new agreement negotiated among New Zealand, Singapore, Iceland, and Switzerland, which you might think that's a weird cast of characters. But essentially, these are countries that say we need to take climate change very seriously. We need to use trade as an instrument to fight climate change, and we really worry about sustainability, right? So what they've done, and essentially the way they think about this, is these are kind of examples that they want to show to the EU, to the US, to the rest of the world, that you can actually negotiate agreements that deal with these issues in a way that makes everybody who signs that agreement better off, right? So this ACCTS is a new kid on the block, which I think is actually quite interesting. And that same group of countries expanded, just came out a few weeks ago with something they call the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, which is essentially, again, a plurilateral club that says we are collectively going to sit around the table and think about how do we need to change the current rules of the game, and where can we potentially negotiate new rules on issue areas which are important for our firms and important in terms of what we have as non-economic objectives, right? And it's essentially the unions or intersections of the ACCTS countries, the EFTA countries that are negotiating these digital partnership agreements that are pursuing this track, right? And I think what is interesting here is that the EU is, of course, out of this. You don't see any European Union states, and you certainly don't see the European Union, but you do see EFTA, right? And EFTA are, of course, European countries that have exactly the same values as we do in the EU. So in a sense, there's a signal there that you could actually go down this track. Now, I'm running out of time, so let me just skip this. I mean, obviously, there's a whole kind of a set of scope conditions that we need to think about in terms of when are plurilateral agreements going to be feasible, when are they going to have to be enforceable, how do we enforce that? So again, all of that is, we can come back to that in the question and answer period, but I would argue, and what we argue in the paper, is to make a distinction between the objectives that are being pursued by policy and the impacts of the instruments that are being used, motivated by that policy objective, right? And I think that's what we have here in this slide. So if you look at different industrial policy or non-economic objectives that governments have and that are motivating all this unilateral activism that we see in the data, you can kind of characterize those unilateral measures in different ways. What we've done here is one way of doing that in terms of what is the goal of the instruments we're using. So what we say is that one option, possibility, is really, this is all about protectionism in a way. We're trying to induce firms to make stuff here at home, right? And this is, of course, something that is nothing new, but it's one way of characterizing the policy instruments that are chosen to pursue a particular objective. So you could say, you need to make stuff here. Why? Because that will improve our competitiveness, or it's going to help us deal with climate, or it'll improve our economic resilience, the resilience of our supply chains, and so forth. A different objective, or in terms of the instruments that are chosen, really what they're saying is, don't trade with those guys, right? So we have a problem with some countries, right? Because they're violating human rights, or because they're a threat to us, or because they're really bad on the climate front, whatever. And then what we want to do is, we just don't want to trade with those countries. We want to exclude them, right? So again, if you then think about mapping that into the set of instruments that are being used by governments, you would say, okay, now we're talking about things like import bans, export bans. We're essentially talking about instruments that are not tariffs. Third possibility, in terms of the unilateral measures we see, is very European, right? So there, the goal of the instrument choice is, we want you to do stuff our way, right? We want to make sure that you don't deforest your land any further. And we're going to kind of determine whether or not deforestation takes place. We're going to do that. We define how we do that. And if you don't do that, you don't get to export to us. So in a sense, it's a very restrictive, potentially restrictive trade policy, because essentially it boils down to a ban, right? If you don't do it, you don't come in. So it's not like an extra 10 or 20 or 50% tariff, you're just basically excluded. So that's one way of mapping measures, mapping instruments in terms of, are they actually benefiting a particular objective, or are they going to make attaining that objective less feasible, right? So one of the things we're in the process of doing and trying to figure out is kind of going through all of this data, looking at these different objectives that are motivating policies, and looking for where are there potential for positive spillovers, negative spillovers, and what type of agreements could be used to actually pursue beneficial outcomes. Now, one of the interesting things about conceptually, if we think about what is the utility of a trade agreement versus plurilateral, issue-specific plurilateral cooperation, trade agreements can cover basically, they can attain any of these objectives, right? So they're very useful instruments if you can actually make them work, if you can negotiate them. So here the real challenge is, can you negotiate these trade agreements with other countries? And that historically has been difficult, right? So one of the reasons we have hundreds of trade agreements today is because it's never been possible for most countries to reopen a trade agreement, right? So if two countries have a trade agreement and a third country wants to join, quite frequently it just stops right there because there's no accession provision. And quite frequently, it's also those two countries that have an agreement don't necessarily want to negotiate with the third country. So the third country then negotiates separate agreements with both of those countries, and that's why we get to where we are. Anyway, so, but trade agreements are potentially there. The plurilateral cooperation could also be focused on what we've called here either a production club or a regulatory club, right? And what we mean by that is a regulatory club would be an agreement where we're really talking about rules about how trade takes place, right? So the whole make it here dimension that the European Union is very much an advocate of in terms of saying we need to set international standards with respect to deforestation or with respect to supply chains. That's then something that gets negotiated, right? So I guess where the differences between the unilateral approach and the plurilateral approach is we collectively start to think about what are the standards that should apply, right? And I think this is the big this would be a big change, I think, for the European Union, because the European Union has not been really willing to do that, right? So the trend really has been towards unilateral definition of what gets done, right? A production club is a potential solution to some of the economic security questions, right? So if we think about critical minerals, clearly it makes sense, at least potentially, and this is something that the Biden administration was doing, and I assume this is all now dead in the water, but they had these mineral security partnerships, which were not bilateral, but which were intended to be a club of countries that needed critical minerals, but also that were willing to invest in greater production of those minerals. And again, what is interesting about the critical minerals example is that Biden was much more focused on international cooperation than the European Union is. So the European Union is doing most of this on a bilateral basis, right? So it's a different approach. So I've already talked too long. So what roles for the EU on these fronts? Clearly the EU has always said, we believe in the multilateral trading system, we believe in rules-based approaches. The EU has been a market leader in preferential trade agreements, right? We have dozens and dozens of trade agreements. So it's always been a bit of a tension between saying we're multilateralist and negotiating trade agreements, but at the same time, the Commission has always managed to square that circle by saying this is allowed in the WTO, right? So there are provisions for trade agreements. We're doing this in a way which is WTO legal, so all good. The EU has also been a proponent of plurilateral agreements, plurilateral initiatives, but only in the WTO, right? So one of the commonalities of the EU approach to dealing with using these different types of instruments is it's been very much wedded to the multilateral trading system, very much wedded to the WTO. So a lot of those initiatives I mentioned that are happening outside the WTO, that are mostly East Asia Pacific, but also Latin American, they don't really include the European Union, right? And I think the big challenge for the EU is twofold or threefold, right? So continue to try and make things work in the WTO, which means a renegotiation over time and to keep the lights on in Geneva, expand the trade agreement context, which I mentioned is going to be quite difficult. But I think the real, what I would call almost low-hanging fruit, is to do much more on the plurilateral track to deal with particular issues which actually matter to us and to our partners, and to move away from the unilateral turn that we've seen in the European Union over the last decade or so, which I think is counterproductive, and we're suffering right now as a result of that, right? So the countries that we really should be working with against what's going on in the United States in terms of trade, the Indonesias, the Malaysias of the world, the Brazils of the world, are seriously irritated at us because of the way we've been doing things for the last decade or so. And yes, of course, we have the Mercosur, EU-Mercosur deal now. But again, that really needed a lot of tweaking to deal with the negative repercussions of what we've been doing unilaterally on that front. So I think it really is something that is an opportunity, but it's not clear that it's going to be all that easy to do. So I think, let me just stop with this point, because I've talked for too long. It's an interesting question. I think partly this being wedded to the WTO is kind of, you can blame the lawyers, right, in the EU. The EU likes to do things, and of course they're used to a system where we have a European Court of Justice, where we have EU law, which gets enforced. So that's always been part of the kind of parallel to the WTO. Trade agreements are allowed, and trade agreements have been pursued actively. So why not more of the plurilateral type of cooperation to deal with many of the issues that are actually undermining the WTO, because we can't make progress in terms of multilateral negotiations, right? And there's a lot of those issues. So I think that's an open research question to which I don't have an answer, but I think part of the answer, aside from socialization and kind of being stuck in a rut and saying we do everything through trade agreements, is the Commission quite frequently doesn't have a mandate. Right, so many of the issues that are being pursued in East Asia and the Pacific, both with respect to trying to achieve particular objectives, consumer protection, data privacy, what have you, are also motivated by an effort to try and facilitate trade. Right, so that's why we're seeing a lot of these agreements. Now, if we're talking about data privacy, the people who negotiate trade agreements for the European Union, that's not their mandate. Right, so we're talking about different parts of the Commission that are responsible for many of the issue areas that are actually causing problems in the trading system. Climate is another example. So if you take the EU deforestation regulation and you ask the people in DG Trade, how much of a role did you guys play in terms of trying to design this in a way which would not create the negative effects that we've had from Brazil, Indonesia, et cetera? And the answer is very little. Right? This was not in our mandate, and we're basically stuck with the consequences. So yes, in the Commission kind of exchange, we raised this, but it was basically ignored. So I think that's one potential explanation. That then ties into silo and coordination problems, but it might also very well be the case that we have DGs that are responsible for a particular area that don't even have a mandate to go out and negotiate internationally. Right, so I think that is something, again, these are all hypotheses which we're going to be working on. But anyway, I think the one area where I see a link, a bridge, is between greater effort to negotiate plurilateral agreements on particular issues as a way of building bridges between the EU and these large other trading blocs like the CPTPP. And one reason why that might actually be incentive compatible, why that might actually be pursued, is it's a way for both the EU and the other East Asia Pacific countries to agree on what the rules of the road are going to be towards China. Right? And I think it's very important in that type of a discussion not to exclude China and say this is the way it's going to be. But again, the plurilateral track provides an opportunity to say, we're not talking about free trade with China, we're really talking about particular rules which are going to guide our actions in a specific area. So there might be more scope for that down the road, and that would then also be a mechanism to facilitate the engagement of a large economy like China, which is of course very different, and to signal to the Americans that there is actually scope to negotiate binding enforceable rules in areas where you think the Chinese are doing things which are negative for you. So even if you don't participate, of course, you're most welcome to join down the road. But I think that provides an opportunity for some optimism, if I can end on an optimistic note.
So I'm going to hand over now to Stephanie as Master of Ceremony, and she'll guide us through the conversation. But thank you, Bernard. That was really terrific.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you so much, Bernard, for this fascinating lecture. I mean, I really not only learned a lot, but I really think that your lecture was in the spirit of the Robert Schuman Center, in the sense of that an economist finds it interesting, a political scientist finds it interesting, a lawyer finds it interesting, I can only imagine, and an international and economic historian as well. So thank you so, so much for actually challenging us to think beyond our disciplines, I would say. I'm going to start off with a question and then ask the audience to in the meantime, think also about questions. And I'm actually not the only master of ceremony. There's also Sarah Bernstein, who's checking online. So I'm asking not only the audience in the room, but the audience also online to ask questions. And so we're going to coordinate. This is why I impolitely have my cell phone next to me. We're coordinating what questions will be asked. Can I help? Your bag. Has anybody seen Bernard's bag? How does it look like? Is it a black bag? Then maybe, we have found it. Very good. Very good. So I just wanted to start off with one question that is what you call yourself one of the two elephants in the room, right? So when you talked about the US, you actually observe a longer term shift in US trade policy, given that Trump 1, Trump 2, but also Biden administration in between have pursued a rather similar trade policy, even though, as you say, every other Biden policy in the international realm was actually more or less orthogonal to what Trump was doing. So I'd just like to hear a bit more from you. What is so particular about trade that we can see a semi-bipartisan consensus, right? And I mean, is it really that bipartisan? And is there any hope for change that is not just like, is it not just structurally driven, but is there will there be an actor that we can hope for in the US that can actually change this, which then also would, of course, reshuffle a little bit the three options that you have outlined?
It is unfortunately very bipartisan. So I think the background is obviously the arguments that trade has actually been bad in terms of its social impact, in terms of distributional implications. The argument is it's led out to a hollowing out of the U.S. industrial base, manufacturing has disappeared, and so forth. So I think that's something that really unites the Republican and Democratic kind of parties' view, insofar as there still is a Republican Party of trade, and why trade is problematic, and in particular why trade agreements are problematic, right? So I don't think that's going to change very, very fast. Now, I think where potentially you could say what would bring the U.S. back to the table in terms of thinking about negotiating rules, it's going to be very much driven by the firms, right? So that's, I think that's the only kind of, angle I can see there, and it's going to be issue specific, right? So if you think about why we have the WTO, so, we started with the GATT. The GATT was basically a traditional trade agreement. The WTO greatly expanded that to include services, intellectual property in particular. Why do we have services and intellectual property in the WTO? It's because of US business, right? Basically nothing really. They were the ones that were really pushing this very hard. So the question in terms of potentially changing the dynamics looking forward is, where are there issues that are really going to mobilize, large US industries that have an interest in the rest of the world in terms of markets to say, okay, we need to deal with what's going on, right? So you could conceptually think about, things like a digital sales tax, the services tax, the whole digital privacy rule dimension, which again is something which is going to directly affect a large number of these European American firms, to think about, okay, we need to kind of agree on how we're going to deal with this. Right, so, but again, that's potential. Is that likely? Given the attitude right now is going to be, no, we're just going to dictate what you guys should be doing, right? And then the question really becomes, are we going to, draw a line in the sand and saying this is not going to happen? But ultimately, I think that the traditional political economy dynamics of large firms who want to be able to sell in markets around the world would kind of help you in this direction. I think also there's right now a really strong sense, and this is, I think, more Republican, but maybe also in the Democratic side, we don't want a bunch of judges telling us whether or not what we're doing is violating our commitments, right? And I think, and if we can't get past that, and it's really going to be a mindset where, listen, we're the most powerful kid on the block, and we will do whatever we want to do, then obviously the prospects for the US coming back into the fold are quite limited. That said, the US is only 15% of GDP, right? So it really then boils down to, as many of you in this room know better than I, it really boils down to what are the issue linkages that are being made in terms of getting partners of the United States to do what they really don't want to do, because there's a threat hanging over their head that if you don't do this, it's not just trade I'm going to hit you with, I'm going to hit you with other stuff. And of course, we are the number one person in the spotlight, entity in the spotlight there.
Thank you so much. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. I do know there's one online as well. Please, if you could briefly introduce yourself. There is a microphone that should come your way. Briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question, please.
So thank you for the presentation. My name is Szilard. So I have one question and one comment. So the question is, when you talk about the initiators and the followers, have you also looked at the role of strategic alliances, military alliances? So there, for example, with outbound screening, both the UK and the EU are looking into having outbound screening for foreign investments going out of these places. And they more or less would want to follow the US. And there's quite some extensive Cold War literature on how in, for example, the 50s as well, the US was using this carrot stick approach, but then it was the Marshall Plan. So it was like, you will not get the Marshall Fund unless you stop exporting XYZ to the Soviet Union. And then the comment is towards the end when you mentioned, you know, what happens at the Commission and what mandate they get, and it's always up to the Council at the end of the day what type of negotiating mandate they give to the Commission. And on the one hand, you very rightly pointed out that it's quite diffused within the Commission of which DG will handle primarily the negotiations. But there's also sort of a member state interest in adding more than just trade. So it's not going to be, let's say, just DG Environment saying, let's put some clauses there at the end of the trade agreement, but it's also for the member states adding extra type of chapters means that now it's going to be a mixed agreement instead of a sole EU agreement, so then they also have potential powers over its ratification, and CETA is a good example, and how they had to then split also the EU-Vietnam, EU-Singapore agreements. So yes, but thank you, this was very, very enlightening.
Bernard, with your permission, I connect one more question and then back to you. I think you also had a question, no? No? There, yeah.
Hi, and thank you. My name is Yves Mény Annual. I'm a visiting fellow from the University of Melbourne in Australia. So I'm wondering, so the EU, a lot of what it has been doing on the FTA front lately has been driven by domestic contestation and politicization of trade. So with plurilateralism, is it likely to be the same? Is plurilateralism a good way to depoliticize trade, perhaps, for domestic audiences, if that's possible at all, especially given that it's going to engage some of these really sensitive issues for national regulatory autonomy? Thank you.
Okay, so on the follower leader issues, this is something that is very much ongoing, right? So we're really thinking about what type of conceptual framing to do around this. So some of the people that we've spoken to and kind of had discussions with, they're telling us you might be much better off using a learning type of model, right? So there really is kind of learning going on in terms of, especially, and again, this is where it becomes interesting in terms of the types of countries and the groups that are either implied by the objectives, or like you mentioned, existing groups that either are in an alliance, but also existing groups that have signed a certain type of environmental treaty, right? So of course, there's a lot more going on than just trade in terms of what countries are doing. So this is something we're very actively kind of pursuing at the moment, to look at what is the relationship between the joint adoption of particular policies motivated by the same objective, right, as defined by these guys at the Global Trade Alert, and are these countries kind of aligned or connected through other types of arrangements, right? So that could be in the defense area, that could be in the environmental area, that could also be in terms of countries taking human rights or labor protection more seriously in terms of what they do in the ILO. So all of that is kind of part of the research program looking forward. And that also includes, you mentioned the Marshall Plan, so that also includes a focus on official development assistance, right? So one of the nice things about the OECD is they have really detailed information on what governments are actually spending, or I would say used to spend on development assistance. And of course, that's an environment that is changing very fast as many countries are cutting back dramatically on their aid. But again, you have the aid dimension, but then you also have things like the Global Gateway, right? So the EU also has a lot of instruments to actually provide finance. And that could then be linked also to these types. So that's all kind of ongoing stuff that we're focusing on. On the mandates, so I think the way you frame the question is actually kind of symptomatic of we're stuck on trade agreements. So we need to get a mandate to negotiate a trade agreement. And of course, you need that mandate because that trade agreement is going to cover a lot of stuff. And then, like you said, member states are adding particular things that they think are important outside the common commercial policy, partly because they worry about this, but partly also because it gives them greater voice in terms of being able to approve what comes out. I think the big difference with the plurilateral kind of thread is it's issue specific. So by definition, you might be in mixed territory because it's really all member states who are controlling this, but you don't necessarily need that mandate, right? So, and I think this is also something for the lawyers to think about in terms of what can you actually do? Because another dimension I didn't talk about, which is also something we're thinking about, is you don't necessarily need all of the 27 to be involved in these plurilateral arrangements, right? So for example, we have this Digital 9 group, which is focusing on trying to do more to develop international standards for the digital economy, right? So again, insofar as that then gets adopted also by countries outside the EU, you can see games being played or a strategy where essentially we're trying to kind of create facts on the ground, which then will influence what the European Union may or may not be able to do if we ever start to legislate this for the EU as a whole. So there are lots of interesting political economy dimensions to that question. On the PTA question and the politicization, so yes, right? So PTAs have increasingly incorporated all kinds of stuff which have very little to do with trade, and partly that is driven by a desire to achieve non-trade objectives, right? So that could be the environment, that could be social, labor standards, whatever. And the EU, of course, has been, again, a market leader on that, which also has made these agreements much more political, right? And again, it goes back to is it a straight trade agreement or is it a mixed trade agreement, et cetera? So that's there. So I would, and again, this is just an argument or a hypothesis, but I think if we go down more this plurilateral track, which is issue specific, it might be a way of really depoliticizing this. So insofar as, and this is of course something that happens already, right? So regulators do agree amongst each other what makes for good regulatory practice. We have a lot of international regulatory cooperation, which is essentially doesn't get politicized. That doesn't mean it couldn't be, it certainly could be, right? So if we're thinking about chicken being washed with chlorine in the United States, clearly that's super political, but I think a lot of this stuff, it's technical, so it might give much more scope for the technical people in governments, not just in the EU, but also in partners, to actually think through what makes sense to do here. And of course, they're gonna have to sell that, they're gonna have to motivate what they're doing, why it is better for them collectively to do this, why it works for consumers, why it works for firms, et cetera. So there's always that political legitimization which is there, but it might be a lot less political in terms of getting to yes. But again, that's just a hypothesis. I think it depends a lot on the issue.
I would give the floor to Sarah Bernstein, who has 2 questions coming from the online audience.
Yes, I will read them out now. The first one comes from Luca De Benedictis, who thanks you for the interesting and informative talk. But he also asks if you don't think that trade economists in academia are too mild in opposing the protectionist agenda by the U.S. administration, and then in parentheses, but for Paul Krugman, question mark. The second question is 3 parts by Jonathan Zeitlin, who writes, he sympathizes with open plurilateral agreements as a goal, but I also wonder whether you don't understate the difficulties of negotiating them, especially on sustainability issues like deforestation. He continues in saying, I don't see much sign that it would have been possible to negotiate OPAs on illegal logging or deforestation without the threat of unilateral actions underpinned by bilateral agreements? And then finally, might there not be viable pathways from unilateral action and bilateral partnerships to OPAs, which would be worth pursuing?
Okay, so is the trade community too mild with respect to Donald Trump? So yes, Paul is definitely out there. Probably yes, but I don't think the trade. I mean, it depends on what how you define who we're talking about, right? So for me, what has really been missing in action is the business community, right? So those are the entities that are directly affected by this. Their bottom line is getting murdered, and they're just keeping quiet. Right now, I don't think you're going to find it very difficult to find your traditional trade economist, me included, kind of to say that everything the Trump administration is doing is completely not in the interest of the United States to start with, and doesn't really make any sense, right? So, and I think there was a fair amount of commentary, you know, when they came out with this wonderful equation as to what is the optimal reciprocal tariff, right? Which is just nuts, right? And that was pointed out very quickly, and there's been, I think, a reasonably large literature already kind of explaining why it is crazy. So I think the trade economists are being subjected to the same thing everybody else is. It's just, you know, overwhelmed by all the noise, right? Because it's not just we have a policy measure which we can then kind of consider and look at the effects, etc. No, this thing changes every day. Right, so the only thing you can say is, you know, this is all crazy. So I think that maybe is part of the explanation, but yeah, I think you could always. I think once it settles down, then I think you'll see a lot more of the traditional analysis in terms of, okay, so what is this actually doing? What is it likely to do? What are the dynamic effects likely to be, et cetera? And I think, you know, the academic community is much more inclined to take that type of an approach. So many of us, certainly me, you know, we're not on X, and I don't go into social media, but maybe we should do more of that, but not me. Life is short. So on Jonathan's question, I absolutely agree. These things are not going to be easy to negotiate, right? But I do think we at least need to start from a premise where we look at whether or not something makes more sense to do in principle among a group of countries, right? And I think deforestation is a good example where, as you know better than I do, you know, the European Union started off with a model which was very much based on voluntary partnerships and actually working with developing countries, and then turning towards a much more hard law approach where we basically defined what the rules and the approach would be. So I think we need to kind of square the circle in a sense. So I fully agree with you that you can't make this voluntary, right? So, but I think we do need to kind of engage in a process where we say, okay, we have a problem, we have a particular objective, we want to stop deforestation. How do we do that in a more efficient way than what we've been doing to date, which was a voluntary type of partnership model, but which was kind of limited. But we now want to expand this to cover more of the products that are associated with deforestation, but to do that with the countries that we're targeting in the room. And that just seems to me common sense. But also, that discussion needs to then be premised on, we're not just going to believe you on good faith. This needs to be enforceable. We need to have enforcement mechanisms. Trade is going to be an instrument in this, but agree more on the standards that are going to apply so that everybody is kind of on board. Right now, insofar as the issue is one where the other parties really have different preferences and different objectives, then you're just going to have to go your own way. But I think in a lot of the areas in which the EU has been active, the objectives of the EU are shared by a reasonably large number of countries. So I think it's a path that should have been, in my view, pursued more proactively. And in a sense, what we're seeing happening now in terms of the deforestation regulation, having been again delayed, I understand, from reading the papers a few days ago, obviously that has not been a very successful effort. So it would have been better, I would argue, to have started off by saying, okay, let's try and make this a cooperative endeavor. And then actually get into these linkages that were also raised with respect to the Marshall Plan, et cetera. There's a lot more instruments that the EU could and should have brought to the table to deal with this, right? And now they're just playing catch up. They're trying to do a bit in Mercosur, et cetera. So I think we just, we got into a hole and we didn't stop digging.
Waltraud, please.
Thank you. Waltraud Scherkle. Bernard, I find it totally plausible what you're saying, and I also believe it is a problem of the EU that always in these international relations, it is extremely navel-gazing until it overcomes its internal decision-making problems. Most things have been decided, and that is a reason why I do not believe that the EU suddenly can become this force in international relations. But I was just trying, while you were talking, and I understand why you focused on this question. So what could the EU-led plurilateral cooperation do? I was asking myself, is it that the world really waits for the EU? Is there not, if I just think of a country like India, that's at the moment also in a very difficult position, is also very nationalist. It's not only the US or, China, the other one. Is that not for a country like India that it says, you know what, quite good that the Europeans also feel for once how it feels when the hegemon is not on your side, and that there is a bit of poetic justice in this. So do we not have to really hope that a country like India or a coalition of powerhouses, of which Singapore, for example, could be part, take this role, and then the EU get its act together to be not left out in the cold?
Just to give you a heads up, I have another 4 raised hands in the audience and 2 online. So I'm going to collect 3 questions now, that's okay. Move back to you and then go back. The microphone is where now? Can you give it to Francesca, please?
Hello, Francesca, Max Weber Fellow. Thank you so much for a very, very fascinating lecture. I have an infinite number of questions, starting with policy diffusions, but maybe I'll focus on the EU as an actor. I found it very interesting. I think also, as you mentioned later on in your lecture, that unilateralism for the EU has not necessarily been on the rise, but has rather been a modus operandi when it came to regulatory production. But what I wonder is whether actually plurilateral cooperation used to be the second point for the EU, and it's no longer. And maybe I'll give an example to make myself understood. But for example, EU emission trading system, unilateral regulatory production, backlash, especially when it came to aviation. And then we saw the EU pursuing plurilateral cooperation through ICAO. And now, independently of how we feel about CORSIA, that's a very good example of the EU utilizing unilateralism as a starting point to then move through plurilateral cooperation, but maybe through international institutions. And I think there can be many other examples in other policy areas, so OTC derivatives and G20 and YOSCO and so on. So the EU has very often done plurilateral cooperation, but through international institutions. And I wonder whether what we're seeing now is that whether this is no longer such of an option because international institutions have been stalling when it came to multilateral negotiations and so on. So I wonder whether how that could also, in a way, lead to further hypotheses to your bigger research question, and whether you also find this on a broader understanding of what plurilateral cooperation could have meant for the EU historically. Thanks.
Mark Schwartz, Virginia. This picks up, I think, Valtraud's question a little bit. The premise behind the question is that voting publics still matter. So it goes to your question of motivation, mobilization. Things are much like the 1930s these days, in the sense that in the 30s, there were 4 big questions, 2 domestic, 2 international. Domestically, would unions be accommodated, and would democracy, some degree of democracy, survive? And internationally, what would be the nature of racial hierarchy in the globe, and would formal empire survive? Today, we can say we see the same 4 questions. What degree of income inequality is politically sustainable? And again, what degree of democracy will emerge or persist? And then internationally, the race question's turned into an immigration question, and the empire question is basically one of can the decline of American hegemony be managed in a Pacific way? In the 30s, there were a lot of different answers to those questions: Catholic corporatism, fascism, communism, some kind of social democracy, and some other things. My question, finally, is what's the EU's pitch to the voting public about the appropriate answer to these questions?
With the permission of the director, I'm going to go a little bit over time, but not much, if that's okay. I know there's an aperitivo waiting for us outside. So, Bernard, if you don't mind, about 5 minutes to answer these questions, so we can go back to a few questions online and one in the audience, and then back to you for the final word.
I took the EU-led out of the title, right? And I think partly that's because there is not going to be EU leadership. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. So the leadership is going to have to come from elsewhere, right? And I think we're seeing that now in the East Asia Pacific. And I think the challenge for those countries is going to be to identify issue areas where you can bring the EU in, right? And I think that's my potential positive spin. It's not going to come from the EU. I think and I think I base that on kind of what we've seen the EU do, not just in the immediate now in terms of dealing with Trump, but also in the past few years. So the coalition approach, I think, is one that is now being kind of built, or at least they're actively trying to do that in the East Asia Pacific, but also and I think they've been very deliberate in bringing in, so Rwanda as part of this group, right? Not because Rwanda matters, but Rwanda is an LDC. We have, I think Morocco is in it. So it's a cross-section of countries that rely a lot on trade, but they're not only in East Asia and the Pacific. So they're trying to build this coalition. So I think the key challenge is going to be identifying particular issues for them to work on and deal with, where you can bring in China, where you can bring in the European Union. So that's I think where hopefully we'll end up. Now India, I don't see India being a constructive force for anything and anywhere. So that's not on trade. But it does raise a question, right? Because obviously these are very big economies, right? So you need to have at least a critical mass. So you need some of the big guys to actually come and participate in these efforts. Otherwise, it doesn't add up. But I think by this the selection is you can actually do that, right? So there are areas where China really has very strong complementarities with what the EU also is trying to do, right? So greening the economy is one. Now, clearly that gets you into all kinds of industrial policy competitiveness conundrums, but at least the ultimate objective we share, right? And which is very different from what the US now is claiming that it wants to do. On Francesca's question, I think that's really interesting, and I think it also relates a bit on what Jonathan was saying, is that essentially you start with unilateral And then you say, okay, that's your counterfactual, and now let's think about what you can do to actually attenuate the negative implications of what we're doing to you. So yes, I think that is definitely something which is part of the, potentially part of the storyline, but a necessary condition is you actually you are willing to go into this plurilateral track, right? And so far, I don't see a whole lot of evidence for that, which might now change because of what we're seeing happening in the world. But I think, yeah, it's very, so one of the things that is in the project is there's a series of case studies that are going to be written by people who both look at success stories of open plurilateral agreements and, ones that didn't work. Why didn't they work? Why did they work? So if you're in the market to write a case study, I'm very much, I'm interested in that ICAO story. Your questions were kind of really big. So what is the EU pitch to answer those questions? I think that's a very good question. I don't have an answer to it. I don't think the EU has an answer to it, and that might be part of the problem, right? And what we've seen in terms of kind of revealed behavior to date is essentially, we try and keep the ship afloat, but we don't really have our own kind of model. And it's going to be a big question, to what extent are we going to let Mr. Trump run over us, and how quickly can we actually get ourselves in a situation where we're not completely dependent on the United States, right? So that is the big question of the day. And, there's a lot of talk. I think there's some action, but I think we need a lot more action.
Let's go back to the online audience. There are 2 questions, and we're going to end with a question here.
There's 3 questions now. The first question was received from Robert Wolf at Queen's University in Canada. Bernard mentioned the possibility of binding enforceable plurilaterals. How does that work outside the WTO framework? And continuing, if you get similar agreements with different participants and hence rules, does that create more uncertainty for firms with supply chains and multiple OPAs? Nicolas Petit's question is first a comment, terrific lecture. And continuing, much EU regulation was passed without an understanding of trade-offs across policies. Is this a structural problem of the EU procedural design? And I will sneak in a third question by Lisbeth Hoog. What is the downside risk, in parentheses cost, for the EU unable to be the coordinator/leader in global trade in transition? We have a 4th question coming in, but Stephanie says no. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Inna Malinkovska, Jean Monnet Fellow. I have the question about trade and values. So especially EU plurilateral trade cooperation was said to be value loaded. And even if EU traded with less liberal states, it was still framed with values. Handel durch Wandel is a famous approach there. So do you such, in one of the slides, as I read that this EU-led plurilateral cooperation is more successful or more likely to be successful if based in interests and not in values, I assume. So do we see also the change in this kind of value foundation of plurilateral cooperation in trade? And if not values, then what? Is it national interest? Is it security? Or is it business interest that you mentioned in one of the answers? Thanks.
And all these wonderful big questions, if you could answer them or try to address them at first, and then we can continue the conversation over aperitivo in about 5 minutes.
Okay. So can we have binding enforceable plurilaterals outside the WTO? Absolutely. You just design them to be binding and enforceable, right? So, so essentially what we're talking about here are conditional MFN type of arrangements, and the benefits don't apply if you don't, play the game. And if the insiders don't play the game, then they get, rejected from the club. So I think I don't think conceptually it's an issue. I just think it's something that, because we've been so socialized to think about doing everything within the WTO, and we have a WTO enforcement mechanism, but that's not, that doesn't mean that is the only way to skin this particular cat. So I think it really becomes then an issue of designing the plurilateral agreements, and that's going to depend a lot on the issues. So are more of these plurilateral agreements going to lead to, you know, a spaghetti bowl? And I think the answer is yes, but I think we're already in that spaghetti bowl. So I think it's better to have fewer bowls where people can actually share the spaghetti as opposed to everybody doing their own thing. So, you know, it's really about, you know, what is the counterfactual? And I think in a lot of these issue areas, it really doesn't necessarily make sense to think about having multilateral agreements, right? Because insofar as countries really do have different preferences in particular issue areas, then it doesn't make sense for them to participate in a multilateral deal. And I think that's part of what has actually been undercutting the WTO, because there has been this perception that, you know, there's really been this imbalance in terms of the effects of the agreements, and many developing countries have taken the view that some of this stuff we never should have signed, and you guys suckered us into this and we don't want to do it. So there is that dimension. Trade-offs. Yeah, I think trade-offs are really missing in action. And I think this is kind of illustrated in some of the policies the EU has adopted. And it's often struck me is that it's very difficult to kind of get a sense, and it's obviously very politically difficult to say, okay, now we're going to start prioritizing what we actually care about. So the values question. So do we really care about those values, or do we really care about the interests, right? And how do you trade those two things off? Now, clearly, if we really are committed to values, we don't trade off, right? Because then you're essentially saying, well, those values are negotiable. So I think this is a real issue, right? And even if you take the values dimension off the table, I don't think there are very good instruments at the EU level to think about what are the implications of what we think is the best thing for us to do, take deforestation, and to consider, okay, so what are the likely downsides of this? What are the potential negative spillovers that are going to be hitting us if we do this, right? And I think that type of discussion, not enough of that type of discussion happens, and again, I think within the Brussels machinery, there should be much more of a focus where the decision makers are actually said, okay, here's what is likely to happen. Now, of course, we have wonderful impact assessment approaches, et cetera, but I don't know if you've looked at a sustainability impact assessment of the EU, but, you know, it's just a kitchen sink of stuff, right? And it's a bit of a tick-the-box exercise. You know, what's actually more important when NGO X says this is what we should do, as opposed to NGO Y, this is what we should do. How are those trade-offs made? It's basically the Commission decides what they want to do, right? So there are real problems there. So I agree with that, and I think that actually addresses the value-based question as well. So.
Thank you so very much. I mean, thank you for actually bringing some optimism to a discussion on transition and disruptions. At least there were moments. Very much appreciated. Thank you to you inside Europa. Thank you to you online for all the great questions. And on that note, thank you.